A series of explosions and gunfire near the Iraqi embassy in the Afghan capital, Kabul. All the attackers have been killed by Afghan forces. Hello and welcome to Al Jazeera, live from our headquarters in Doha. Me, Elizabeth Puranam, also ahead. Venezuela's president claims victory in a controversial vote for a new constituent assembly, as at least 10 people are killed in election violence. Thousands of Syrian refugees prepare to leave the Lebanon border region as part of an exchange for Hezbollah fighters. And a laid-back look at life, an insider's view of what's known as the House of Light in the land of the rising sun. ISIL says it's responsible for an attack at the Iraqi embassy in Afghanistan's capital, Kabul. 3 gunmen were killed by Afghan security forces at the compound in the business district of the city. And earlier, a 4th attacker detonated an explosive near the entrance to the embassy. 1 police officer was injured in the assault. Jennifer Glass was near where the fighting had been taking place.
More gunfire coming from the site of the siege there. The Iraqi embassy is 2 blocks behind me. Right now, Afghan special forces are inside fighting what we believe are 3 attackers. Now, this assault began when a car bomb was set off by the gates of the Iraqi embassy, and then gunmen went in behind it. As many as 3 attackers, according to the Interior Ministry, and now Afghan special forces have gone into that compound. As you can hear by the gunfire, we've heard a number of explosions. They are trying to dislodge those fighters from inside that compound. Iraqi diplomats, we understand, still inside the compound as well. A tricky situation. And as you can see, this is a normal area of Kabul, a regular residential street, homes, apartments, businesses. On the next block where the embassy is, there's also a radio station. They have evacuated their staff. This taking everybody by surprise. There was black smoke rising until just a few minutes ago, but clearly the fight going on seems very intense and far from certain as to how this is all going to turn out.
Well, let's get more from Jennifer now. She's joining us live from Kabul. We're hearing, Jennifer, that this operation might be over. What are you hearing?
That's what we hear as well. The Interior Ministry here in Kabul has issued a statement explaining what happened at just after 11 o'clock this morning. A suicide bomber blew up at the gates of the Iraqi embassy, and then 3 attackers went in behind him. The firefight went on for quite a long time. We understand it is over now, that security forces are going room to room to ensure that everybody is out of that. But the Interior Ministry says that all the Iraqi diplomats, including the Iraqi ambassador, are safe and out of that embassy compound. That will be a relief, because I have to say we were down there and the fighting was quite intense. Bombs going off, explosions, lots of gunfire going on for several hours in the very heart of a residential part of Kabul. So it seems to all be over for now. This, of course, comes in the middle of the city. Security has already been tightened here. People have been on edge. There was another car bomb just a week ago that killed 24 people on the west side of the city. The target of that was a minibus full of government employees, but the target, the Iraqi embassy here in Kabul, and as you said, ISIL has claimed responsibility.
And just how unusual is what we've seen in the last few hours, Jennifer, because as you've mentioned, that suicide bomb a week ago which killed around 25 people, but this was a number of hours, a number of explosions and gunfire being exchanged.
Well, you know, we have seen attacks like this in Kabul. First of all, this is only the 2nd attack that ISIL has carried out in the Afghan capital. They bombed a demonstration last summer, but the fact that they can get in here really shows that they are trying to prove that they are a resurgent force. Some of these complex attacks have been terrible. There was one here in Kabul earlier this year on the hospital. That also went on for quite a while. If the attackers can get into the compound, that's when the trouble starts, because they can go in, there are civilians inside, and they can go room to room, hold people hostage, and it's very hard to dislodge them. And in all of these attacks, the attackers generally are willing to die in the fighting. So it makes it very difficult for Afghan security forces. Many of them often have, we see, suicide vests as well. So, you know, we've security here in the capital has been a real concern. Afghans have been demonstrating, calling on the government to protect them more. We've seen security gates go up to protect against truck bombs. These were 4 people on foot, a suicide bomber on foot, who actually got into the Iraqi embassy. So I think it's going to make Afghans here in Kabul even more nervous.
Jennifer, thank you very much for that. Afghan correspondent Jennifer Glass, live in Kabul. Thank you. Let's move on to other news now. And Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro has claimed victory in a controversial vote to elect a new assembly with powers to rewrite the constitution. The electoral board says 8.1 million people took part, but the opposition says the vote was fraudulent and is calling for more protests. The European Union says it has doubts as to whether it will recognize the results. Our Latin America editor Lucia Newman reports from Caracas.
There was never any question about who would win an undisputed election boycotted by opposition parties.
El pueblo de Venezuela ha demostrado.
The Venezuelan people have shown that when fate challenges us, when the stateless oligarchy challenges us, when imperialism challenges us, it is when we make known the blood of the liberator that runs through the veins of men, women, children and youths.
But it was far from the peaceful civic celebration that the government had described. From northern Venezuela to Caracas, there were running battles between demonstrators and security forces, taking one of the deadliest tolls since protests against the Constituent Assembly election began months ago. Among the dead, a 13-year-old boy and a National Guardsman. The Constituent Assembly and its newly elected delegates will make up a super legislative body dominated by government loyalists, which will not only rewrite the Constitution, but could dissolve the opposition-controlled Congress. Many see it as the end of democracy.
Today we're seeing that this dictatorship has just lost the little bit of legitimacy that it might have had.
Voters in this low-income neighborhood, like Lydia, seemed unsure about the Assembly's aims. An improvement for the country, that's what they're telling me, she says. Faced with a low turnout, local organizers asked voters to sign a list with their document in hand to determine who had still not shown up. This is called the red point or the red control area. After people go through this procedure, they go to another area where their new ID card is scanned. That information goes directly to the ruling Socialist Party so that they know exactly who has or who hasn't voted. As expected, the government declared it had won a historic show of support, while opposition leaders estimated a less than 13% turnout.
Today can be summed up in 2 words: abstention and repression. Tomorrow we begin a new stage of struggle, of non-recognition of a fraudulent process that the Venezuelan people rejected.
Venezuela's government will also face a stronger wave of protests from abroad, including the imminent threat of new economic sanctions from Washington. Lucia Newman, Al Jazeera, Caracas.
Qatar has rejected renewed calls by 4 Arab countries to concede to a list of demands in order to end the Gulf crisis. The foreign ministers of Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain and Egypt met on Sunday, but offered no new plan to move forward. They did reportedly loosen the air blockade of the country, but Qatar says that isn't happening. David Chater reports.
It appeared to be the first ever concession made since the blockade was imposed on Qatar 2 months ago, opening up air corridors for the country's aeroplanes to use in case of emergencies. According to the official Saudi news agency, 9 such corridors had been identified, including one in international airspace over the Mediterranean, which will be monitored by the Egyptian authorities. But Qatar's transport ministry has dismissed it as false information. The report came after the foreign ministers of the 4 blockading countries met in Bahrain and announced that there would be no concessions and no compromises for Qatar.
They speak of every issue except how to put an end to the support and the financial support of terrorism, and of spreading malice and hatred and intervening in our domestic affairs. We are prepared to sit and negotiate with the Qataris on how to implement our demands. We have no concessions to make and no compromises to offer.
We are ready for dialogue with Qatar, they said, but only on the mechanisms needed to implement, totally and completely, the 13 demands originally made at the start of the blockade, and 6 so-called principles later added to that list.
What came out from this meeting was a number of contradictions, following on from the contradictions we've already heard from the blockading state's officials. First, this statement says that Qatar must accept the 13 demands and the 6 Cairo principles. This is a clear contradiction of the last of the 13 demands, which says in one of its articles that the list of demands will be void if not accepted within 10 days.
The 13 original demands included the closure of the Al Jazeera network and the Turkish military base in Qatar, as well as the downgrading of diplomatic relations with Iran. Mediation by Kuwait still faces considerable obstacles, but pressure from the United States does appear to be having some effect. Ground briefing by an official in Rex Tillerson's State Department after the press conference made it clear the United States would like to see the 4 countries begin to take some positive action. The reopening of Qatar's land border would be an important good faith gesture, he was quoted as saying. We will be most successful in countering terrorism with a united Gulf Cooperation Council, and direct talks would be an important next step. David Chater, Al Jazeera, Doha.
Well, Qatar's foreign ministry is denying accusations by Saudi Arabia that it's trying to politicize the annual Islamic Hajj pilgrimage to Mecca. Saudi says Qatari pilgrims can enter the country subject to certain restrictions. Qatar had criticized Saudi Arabia for refusing to guarantee their safety and impeding trips to Mecca.
Qatar never politicized the issue of the Hajj. It was Saudi Arabia trying to politicize the Hajj pilgrimage amid the Gulf crisis. There's been no suggestion by any Qatari official about internationalizing the issue.
Now let's go to Syria, where preparations have begun to evacuate several hundred Syrian fighters and their families, along with thousands of refugees from the Lebanese-Syrian border, in a ceasefire agreement between Hezbollah and local rebel fighters from Jabhat Fatah al-Sham. Around 9,000 people will be taken to rebel-held areas in Syria. In exchange, the opposition faction will release 8 Hezbollah fighters. On Sunday, the bodies of rival fighters were swapped as part of the deal. Let's get more on this now with our correspondent Imtiaz Taib. He's joining us live from Labwe in Lebanon. That's not far from the Arsal border region. So let's look at this, Imtiaz. A ceasefire, a body swap, internally displaced swap, and it seems to be coordinated between armed groups mediated by the Lebanese government. I mean, how unprecedented is this if it works?
Well, Elizabeth, this is an extraordinarily complex deal, and if it works, it will be a very significant win for Hezbollah itself more completely. This has been an operation that Hezbollah has widely seen as a major success for them. After launching this operation, really only around 6 days later, they managed to push the group formerly known as Nusra into a corner, if you will, and that ultimately led to a ceasefire. Now, since then, we've seen, of course, an awful lot of negotiations going on, negotiations which have been led by senior security officials here in Lebanon. And as you rightly point out, we are now seeing the beginning of this very complex agreement working itself out, starting with Sunday, in which we saw the remains of fighters from both sides return to each other. Now we're seeing and now we're hearing that imminently, really in the next few hours or so, we could see Hezbollah fighters released back to Hezbollah. And then after that, we will start seeing this population transfer, if you will. As you rightly point out, many of those people belong to Nusra as well as their family. Again, the group currently known as Jabhat Fatah al-Sham. But we also understand that as part of this agreement, thousands of Syrian refugees who have been living here in Lebanon for some time will also be exiting Lebanon with this armed group. We know that they will be going to an area in Idlib province, but the logistics of this, as you've been saying, very complex, very difficult, and we're still a distance away from this happening. So a very tense situation here on the ground.
What seems to have precipitated such a complicated working agreement, Imtiaz, and do we know how it will be implemented or policed?
Well, I think the complexity of this agreement, the complexity of this deal really just mirrors the complexity of the situation in Syria, and perhaps more specifically, the complexity of the situation on the ground here in Lebanon with this border area with Syria. This is the final pocket. The Arsal area, which you see behind me, is the final pocket or the final stretch of the Lebanese border, which is still vulnerable to armed groups who are opposed not only to Syrian President Bashar al-Assad, which of course is allied with Hezbollah, but is also a security threat to the Lebanese military and indeed the Lebanese civilian population here. So again, a major win for Hezbollah, which of course is a very powerful force here in Lebanon, certainly a powerful force on the ground in Syria to secure this one area. But as we've been saying, how it's going to play out on the ground involves a lot of actors. It involves Hezbollah, it involves the Lebanese military, it involves the Syrian regime, and of course the armed group that's at the center of this, a group formerly known as al-Nusra. Now, we also understand that there is a neutral actor here, and that is in the form of the Lebanese Red Cross. They will be escorting many of these buses, if you will, that we've been seeing amassing in this area. Buses which does need to be said are still empty. We haven't seen any refugees or any of these fighters get on these buses yet. But again, lots of tension surrounding this deal. Hezbollah really wants to make it work, and they're doing whatever they can to make it work. But again, we'll have to see how things unfold in the coming hours.
Imtiaz, thank you very much for that. Imtiaz Taib joining us live from Labwe. Thank you. Still ahead on the bulletin, South Korea holds an emergency meeting after the US and Japan agree to take further action on North Korea over its recent missile launch. And tension over Jerusalem's Al-Aqsa Mosque may have subsided, but some say the reality has changed for people in the occupied Old City.
Hello, another belt of rain is working its way through the Korean peninsula. It's rather ragged, as you can see, so you're going to get sporadic, decent rainfall and then a spell without any at all. It's gone south of Beijing now. The temperature in Beijing in the sunshine is about 30, but it's settled weather, which isn't necessarily a good thing. It's still pretty hot and humid too, 35 in Seoul and Pyongyang. With the cloud increasing, it's a little less hot in Tokyo, but it's still going to be humid. And rain is going to be in and out, I think, of Honshu on the east coast, while more rain develops around the Yellow Sea and Beijing, washing out your air quality. On Wednesday, that should be an improvement. Now, we have seen recently quite big changes in the rest of China. Gone is the heat wave, because this pair, as it was, of typhoons or tropical cyclones at least, has left a deluge of rain in Taiwan and is now falling as rain and the Chinese mainland. This is over a metre of rain in the last 3 days. That's in southwest Taiwan. I think you know that story quite well. But now you've got a mass of moisture which will fall out as rain and cool things down a bit. But you've still got 36 degrees in Shanghai. That must be very unpleasant. The sun is out rather than it raining temporarily, but the rain's not far away. And with the humidity, yes, the temperature's down a little bit, but I think it still looks pretty stifling.
In a new series, Al Jazeera explores prominent figures of the 20th century and how rivalries influenced the course of history.
Steve Jobs was a much better marketeer than Bill Gates was.
Apple is going to reinvent the phone.
Bill made software what it is today. Bill changed the world.
Two high-tech visionaries whose breakthroughs inspired a digital revolution. Jobs and Gates, face to face, at this time on Al Jazeera.
With us on Al Jazeera. These are our top stories. 3 gunmen have been killed by Afghan security forces at the Iraqi embassy compound in Kabul. Earlier, a 4th attacker detonated an explosive near the entrance to the embassy. ISIL says it's responsible for the attack. 1 police officer was injured in the assault. Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro has claimed victory in a controversial vote to elect a new assembly with powers to rewrite the constitution. The opposition says the vote was fraudulent and is calling for more protests. Qatar is rejecting renewed calls by 4 Arab countries to concede to a list of demands in order to end the Gulf crisis. The foreign ministers of Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain and Egypt met on Sunday but offered no new plan to move forward. Russian President Vladimir Putin has ordered the United States to cut its diplomatic staff in Moscow by more than 700. The move's in response to new U.S. sanctions against Russia and the expulsion of 35 Russian diplomats from Washington. Rory Challens has more from Moscow.
Vladimir Putin says that he's been waiting for quite some time for an improvement in the relationship with the United States, but he has concluded that if that change is coming, well, it's not coming anytime soon. So 755 employees of the US diplomatic service in Russia will be losing their positions. We can look into those numbers a little bit. We do not have the official data for current employment levels, but if we go back to 2013, there were 1,279 staff in Russia. Only 300 or so of those, though, were direct hire positions from the United States. The rest, over 900, were locally employed positions. Now, that means that if the US chooses to, it can keep its core services here, diplomacy and intelligence, relatively unscathed and swing the axe most severely at the local hire positions. What it shows, though, is that Russia is keeping the door open. Numbers like this can ebb and flow, and they can be boosted fairly fast if Moscow decides that the relationship with the United States has improved and the frost has thawed slightly. But I think it's safe to say, as Putin showed, that they are losing patience. They are losing their hope that this is going to change soon. Donald Trump is being curtailed, having his powers limited by Congress, and that makes him a weaker president in the eyes of Moscow. And his powers to deal directly with Moscow and do a deal with them are now less than they were before. So Russia's got to think what it's going to do next. There are numerous spheres around the world, like Ukraine, like Syria, like Afghanistan, North Korea, trouble spots for the United States that Russia can make even more troublesome if they want to.
South Korea is warning of further nuclear and missile tests by North Korea. An emergency meeting was held in Seoul, with the South Korean Defense Ministry adding that Pyongyang is capable of conducting nuclear tests at any moment. Kathy Novak reports from Seoul.
North Korea's latest intercontinental ballistic missile test demonstrated that it has a weapon that could hit the U.S. mainland. Another crucial component is developing a nuclear warhead that could be mounted on this kind of missile. The North conducted its most recent nuclear bomb test last year. A senior South Korean Defense Ministry official is warning another nuclear test is likely, as are more missile launches. Despite that, South Korea's leaders aren't closing the door to talks.
There's not even a bit of change in our military stance, in that it sternly responds to North Korea's provocations. However, I will say that our door of dialogue is always open.
But the message from the United States is that it is losing patience. In a phone call, President Donald Trump and the Prime Minister of U.S. ally Japan agreed further action needs to be taken on North Korea. At the same time, tough words for China. The U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, Nikki Haley, said the U.S. would not call for an emergency meeting of the Security Council. An additional Security Council resolution that does not significantly increase the international pressure on North Korea is of no value, Haley said in a statement. In fact, it is worse than nothing, because it sends the message to the North Korean dictator that the international community is unwilling to seriously challenge him. China must decide whether it is finally willing to take this vital step. China did condemn North Korea's test launch, but Chinese leaders object to increasing the number of U.S. THAAD missile defense batteries in South Korea. The U.S. tested a THAAD interceptor from Alaska on Sunday. The U.S. Missile Defense Agency said it was the 15th successful intercept out of 15 THAAD tests. The ground-based missile defense system uses powerful radar to detect and stop incoming ballistic missiles from reaching their target. China contends the defense system undermines its security.
The South Korean government had put the final rollout of the THAAD system on hold, but is now moving to install the remaining launchers, at least temporarily, in response to the latest threat. The Parliamentary Defense Committee chief says he believes the North now has the atmospheric re-entry technology that is a key element to the nuclear-tipped ICBM it is trying to develop. Kathy Novak, Al Jazeera, Seoul.
Now, 2 weeks of tension at the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound in Jerusalem have cooled down, but some Palestinians say the existing state of affairs is changing. A well-known Palestinian activist is out and about with his camera to document what's happening in the occupied Old City. Our correspondent Stephanie Decker caught up with him.
Everyone knows Rami Khatib, a child of East Jerusalem's Old City. He knows every corner of these maze-like ancient streets.
When I was 12, I began to depend on myself. So I went to the school here, and at the same time I opened a stand in the street. That's when the love story between myself and the Old City of Jerusalem began. I got to know people, the shop owners, the youth, and my entire life was inside the Old City of Jerusalem.
He's an activist documenting what happens here. He says capturing incidents on camera is so important because there's no equality for Palestinians. Many have been released, he says, after he gave them his pictures to be used in court. He himself has also been arrested by the Israeli security forces. Here he is filming Jerusalem Day 2 years ago, an Israeli national holiday commemorating the reunification of Jerusalem after it occupied the east of the city after the 1967 Six-Day War. He says he's confronted by the right-wing march.
The situation is very dangerous inside the Old City of Jerusalem. There are a lot of provocations. The Judaization of the area. There are provocations against churches and mosques. In the Al-Aqsa compound, there are a lot of provocation by the extremists.
Under the sensitive status quo that governs the holy site, Jews are not allowed to pray here. But there have been increasing calls for that to change, including from members of the Israeli parliament. The site is known to Jews as the Temple Mount, and they consider it their holiest site. And this is why Palestinians believe Israel has a bigger plan to slowly take control of the site, which is under Jordanian administration. Al-Aqsa is a sensitive issue, as shown by the popular movement of the last 2 weeks.
The world should know that this is a very dangerous situation. In my opinion, before the conflict with the Israelis was political. Now they are pushing the people and themselves to make it a religious one. And if this continues, it would be a big problem.
Rami shows us the various Israeli flags flying over the Old City. He says more and more right-wing Jews are moving in. A fact, he says, no Palestinian can change. Here a group stands in the shadow of the Dome of the Rock. Israel says it has no intention of changing the status quo of this holy site. But for the Palestinians of Jerusalem's Old City, the facts on the ground send a different message. Stephanie Decker, Al Jazeera, in the Old City of Jerusalem.
Now, finally, this bulletin. A guest house deep in West Japan's countryside is attracting thousands of tourists. The House of Light was created by artist James Turrell 17 years ago. Its manager explains how Turrell used shadow and light to create a sanctuary for meditation.
My name is Shinako Nagumo. I manage the House of Light. It was built by an American artist, James Turrell, the magician of light. Guests can stay overnight to experience his artwork. Mr. Turrell was given Junichiro Tanazaki's essay on Japanese aesthetics called In Praise of Shadows. He decided to incorporate his art of light inside a traditional Japanese architecture. House of Light has a sliding roof that can be opened when the weather is good. The ceiling has a square cutout for observing the sky from below. When you open the roof, light pours in. The square light pattern travels through it. At around lunchtime in summer, the light falls straight into the center. When you lie down, it might feel as though you are up in the sky and looking downward. It's an artwork for your perceptual experience. Light programs start from around sunset and sunrise. The sky changes in color. because of the effects of indirect illumination on the ceiling. The sky appears as a complement color against the light program because of optical illusion. At the end of the night program, it transforms into jet black. The bath on the first floor offers another experience of light. Optical fibers are used along the side of the bathtub and the steps. The bath is filled with light. When you step in, you can see its luminescence. When you open the roof, you are outside. When you close the roof, you are inside. Along the corridor, you can experience the season, the sound of nature. It's a boundless world. I think encountering time, nature, and light leads you to meditation.
Hello again, I'm Elizabeth Paranam in Doha with the headlines on Al Jazeera. 3 gunmen have been killed by Afghan security forces at the Iraqi embassy compound in Kabul. Earlier, a 4th attacker detonated an explosive near the entrance to the embassy. ISIL says it's responsible for the attack. 1 police officer was injured in the assault. Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro has claimed victory in a controversial vote to elect a new assembly with powers to rewrite the constitution. At least 10 people were killed in election day violence. The opposition says the vote was fraudulent and is calling for more protests. Qatar is rejecting renewed calls by 4 Arab countries to concede to a list of demands in order to end the Gulf crisis. The foreign ministers of Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain and Egypt met on Sunday, but offered no new plan to move forward. Preparations have begun to evacuate several hundred Syrian fighters and their families, along with thousands of refugees from the Lebanese-Syrian border, in a ceasefire agreement between Hezbollah and local rebel fighters, including al-Nusra. Around 9,000 people will be taken to rebel-held areas in Syria. In exchange, the opposition faction will release 8 Hezbollah fighters. On Sunday, the bodies of rival fighters were swapped as part of the deal. Russian President Vladimir Putin has ordered the United States to cut its diplomatic staff in Moscow by more than 700. The move's in response to new U.S. sanctions against Russia and the expulsion of 35 Russian diplomats from Washington. Putin wants the number of U.S. staff in Moscow reduced by nearly 2/3 to 450.
We have a lot of options how to respond. Why now? Because the US has made this, what's really important, unprovoked step to deteriorate the US-Russia ties, to impose illegal restrictions, to influence their allies who want to develop relations with Russia. I decided that it's time for us to show that we will not leave anything without response. Is it a lot? Well, from the point of view of an embassy, it's considerable.
Those are the headlines on Al Jazeera. Inside Story is coming up next.